Hello, friends of the IACL blog, and welcome to another book interview. I'm Pravar Petkar, one of the assistant editors of the blog, and currently a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh Law School. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professors Marco Goldoni and Mike Wilkinson to talk about their new edited collection, the Cambridge Handbook on the Material Constitution, published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. By way of introduction, Professor Marco Goldoni is Professor of the Philosophy of Law at the School of Law, University of Glasgow, and Professor Mike Wilkinson is Professor of Law at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Very warm welcome to both of you, and many congratulations on the publication of this collection.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we dive into some of the more substantive details of the collection and how it actually came about, I just want to focus in a little bit on the title, which is the Cambridge Handbook on the Material Constitution. I guess the best place to start is, what is the Material Constitution? What makes it different to other ideas of the Constitution that we might talk about, write about, and discuss?
Thanks, Pravar. Great question, and an obvious question in some ways, but also a surprisingly difficult one, given that the Material Constitution is a broad concept that sort of resists a straightforward definition. But I'm gonna offer one, which is to say that the Material Constitution is the elements that reproduces a social order as a constitutional order. In other words, how does a constitution exist beyond the text, but including the text, including the significance of the text itself? Now, in some ways, that could open up an endless discussion. So we offer a way of analyzing it, what we call the layers of the Material Constitution, and we talk in the MLR article that this was born from in terms of political unity, the institutions, the necessary to make social power into political and constitutional power, the social relations that are undergirding that, and the political objectives that any constitutional order will follow. These are, I would say, necessary but not sufficient for the continuation of a constitutional order. And I think one more thing worth adding is that we're talking here about a modern constitutional order. We're not offering a theory that will encapsulate constitutionalism in some abstract sense. So it is a concept, and it's a concept that goes to our self-understanding of how we think about societies as having constitutions, continuing to have constitutions. But whether it's understood in the material sense is also contingent upon various historical circumstances. So as we note in the introduction, there are times when society is more self-aware of its material constitution, times of turbulence, times of great change, times of crisis, and times perhaps where the material constitution disappears from view. And we can think maybe about the influence of various traditions, Marxism and conservatism, amongst others. But in each case, whether it's fully sort of self-consciously reflected upon, or whether it disappears from view, it continues to operate. So in a sense, we're revealing that material and trying to put it in full view. I don't know if Marco wants to add something, or you want to follow up.
I mean, I suppose the question that springs to mind is, we're clearly looking here beyond and alongside the constitutional text. So we're not only focusing our inquiry on the text itself. I think all three of us are based in the UK, and the political constitution always keeps coming up as a phenomenon. What makes the Material Constitution different, for example, to the political constitution?
Yeah, so this sort of might lead us slightly into the next question, but and Marco will want to add something, I'm sure. But if we, in sense that this was my entry point into the Material Constitution, starting off with what we saw as the sort of poverty of theoretical analysis on the legal constitution. The political constitution adds, of course, the dimension of parliaments and the political process. But if that remains as an abstract normative debate between what's better to have running the show, courts or parliaments, it can also end up in a rather sterile debate. So we have to know how parliaments function, whether they are acting as mediators in between society and the state, whether they are functional and operational, because otherwise we just end up with another sort of sterile normative debate. So the material constitution, I would see it as an addendum to the political constitution, which takes the debate away from courts, but doesn't take it far enough in that it doesn't tell us this key, doesn't address this key issue, which is how social power is translated into political power and then ultimately constitutional power.
So is it then that sort of widening of the debate, the widening of the discussion, as you put it, was that a main reason for sort of exploring this idea of the material constitution? And I guess why now as well? Why here in 2023 or over the last few years?
Well, can I reply with another question? Why not before? I mean, why so late? Actually, that's it. I think is the right question. No? How is it possible that we have not thematized the material nature of constitutional orders before last decade? I mean, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, because of course it's a different question, and I think we will have time to talk about this later. No, so how is it possible that we have been entangled in a debate between what is the best institution for protecting fundamental rights, courts or parliaments, while in the meantime you could clearly see and you could clearly perceive the constitutional relevance of other institutions which could not be thematized from the perspective of the debate between legal and political constitutionalism? I will just drop there two easy examples. Central banks. No one in the last 20 years can deny that central banks, at least in Western constitutional orders, do play a constitutional function, whether it is formally recognized or not. And the military, the army. I mean, how is it possible to think about the US constitutional order without thematizing the centrality of the army as an ordering factor of the constitutional order? This is quite astonishing if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, at the point at which I entered these theoretical debates, my particular area of study was the European Union and the Euro crisis, and to try and understand the Euro crisis without looking at these, let's say, semi-formal or formally informal institutions was to simply miss where the action was happening, including the constitutional action as it then appeared through these various challenges, constitutional courts versus the ECB and so on and so forth.
So is it then fair to say that this is in part, perhaps not entirely, but at least in part, a product of what we might call a shift in the institutions that are actually having an influence over our society? You mentioned central banks, the military, or is this a case of these institutions have always had influence and we just haven't been looking at it in certain circles?
Well, I think it's both. So to go back to what Marco said, is that of course we should be asking, well, how was it the case that for so long these more informal institutions and the social power that goes with them was missed? Why was there a sort of a dominance? And we do in the handbook explain the sort of rise and fall of the material constitution. We explain how after the Second World War, there's a dominance of or even a hegemony of a particular liberal model that leads to the sort of gradual disappearance of the material discourse, but with exceptions. So, for example, Kolya Moller in his chapter shows how even in the sort of prime sort of liberal normative context of post-war West Germany, some scholars in the case he's looking at, Abendroth, looked for the continuing existence of constituent power as a way to think about how even West German constitutionalism might change. So I think that there is always a material constitution that is there for analysis, but there is a point that you make, which is that in moments of crisis, the light sort of shines through and illuminates these deeper, darker features because of a crisis of hegemony. And so it does correspond to, I think, stability and instability in the constitutional order in terms of how obvious the material constitution is, which is not to say that when it's not obvious, it isn't still there.
And I suppose the other aspect of this, we started by talking sort of about the Anglo-Saxon world that we're all sort of based in, but before this, separately, how much interest has there been in the material dimension of the Constitution outside this small bubble, and particularly say different jurisdictions, other languages? Is there sort of a background there?
Well, I would say that what has happened is quite interesting. First of all, I'm not so sure that the debate that is happening in the, let's say, Anglo-speaking bubble is a small bubble by now. It's actually quite a big bubble in my view, and it's definitely a hegemonic one. So hegemonic that I would say that what has happened is that traditions were fully aware of the material aspect or dimension of the constitutional order, most of them European continental traditions, and especially I would say France, Germany, and Italy. Kind of, I would say, saw the concept which was central in the tradition of constitutional studies, and that their students in law school would encounter normally in the first year course of constitutional law, totally marginalized, I mean, to the point of almost being, I would say, forgotten or at least considered partially irrelevant. Now, this is a story, I think, of the rise or hegemonic rise of a certain type of liberal constitutional theory that spread from the Anglo-Saxon world to other parts of the world. No? And I think this explains actually why for several decades there was no thematization of the material constitution in the Anglo-speaking debates. I mean, the situation is obviously more complicated and more nuanced at one level in certain continental traditions. No, I mean, in the French and the Italian one especially, I mean, there's always been a certain sectors, at least of the constitutional scholarship, were somehow aware of the importance of the material dimension. A different thing is how you understand the materiality of the constitutional order, because of course there are different entry points or points of observation of the same object, right?
Thinking about those different entry points that you mentioned and some of the different contexts there, the next question I'd ask is, we've got this whole edited collection. What exactly is in it? So I noted we sort of divided it into these three parts. There's the theory, there's some critique, and there's some application. So what are some of the key ideas that come out of that?
Yeah, so the collection is a broad one, and partly that goes to the story of how we got to end up writing a handbook rather than just an edited collection. But it meant that we could be extremely ecumenical in our approach and take on not only scholarship on the material constitution, which comes from very different and even opposing political directions, but also includes chapters on those who are authors who are more skeptical of the value of the concept, and even those who seem to have some opposition to it. So it was very important for us to offer, particularly in terms of this springboard for further research, that we had a very wide set of approaches. That goes, I think, for each part that you identify. So it starts with history, where we sort of trace the evolution of the concept, not only in the Marxist tradition, but also in the conservative tradition and even in the liberal tradition, and how over time it sort of has these moments of more where it's more in our face, as it were, and moments where it sort of recedes from view. But also in terms of the challenges that are presented in part two by authors who are sometimes sympathetic, but who want to really, I suppose, challenge us in elucidating why this concept is important from different perspectives. And those, in fact, so perhaps worth mentioning two chapters, one on imperialism and one on theories of the federation by Senior Larson and Eva Nanopoulos, which, in a way, the challenge from their point of view is actually that this notion is more expansive than just to be applied to the kind of classical state form, and that the material constitution is a useful way of understanding imperialism, in fact, a necessary way of understanding imperialism, in the sense that society reproduces itself through interstate relationships of domination between states, and in the case of the federation, even within a regional setting. So it's a very broad focus. Part 3, maybe Marco might want to say a little bit more about this in terms of the various jurisdictions, contains chapters from diverse jurisdictions, from China to India to South America, again showing, I think, how the concept is methodologically of great utility, irrespective of jurisdiction and irrespective of the political background of the authors. So we deliberately took a wide approach.
Yeah. I just want to add about part 3 that the idea was to show that although historically speaking, the notion, the concept, and the history of the concept is fundamentally European history, that there is still a certain salience of relevance, actually probably even more outside of Europe. No? So that's why we want the chapters on countries or empires like China, India, and of course, we wanted also to show that there is a possibility of looking at the material constitution as a form of political unity, because this is the big challenge, even beyond the form of the state. No? So the chapter on the European Union is a classic example. No? You don't have a state there, but you still have an organized unity, no? Which is sufficiently organized and sufficiently coherent to basically produce a material constitution and to participate in the consolidation of societal relations at the supranational level and within, penetrating within social relations at the national level. So that's why it's kind of so broad, chapter 3. It is also a way to show to those who are working in different national traditions that the concept is very helpful. And I mean, my guess is that there is also potential expansion, but this is probably for future work for a comparative perspective.
So I think it's fair to say from what you're saying then that perhaps we've started off with a European concept and it's now something of global relevance. Would that be a sort of fair comment, or?
Yeah, so I suspect.
Well,
Sorry, no, I was just going to say I suspect it was already, in a sense. So thinking about, for example, the influence of imperialism in the late 19th century on the formation of European states. So it's not just that this has become globally relevant now. It was, in a sense, already globally relevant, but there are, of course, specific projects of post-colonial nation building where it kind of comes into its own. And for example, the chapter on India is a remarkably insightful piece on the interrelationship between the colonial building of the constitution and features of the imperial and new global order as it emerges in the 20th century. So yes, I think that's right. It starts off under the debates. Of course, there's a lot on interwar in the history, but even there's a chapter by a colleague on the impact of the material constitutionalism in the US. Laughlin's chapter on Lasky shows that even in this sort of peculiar Anglo setting, there is a keen debate on the material issues of constitutional change and elsewhere. So I think it is a concept which has a fairly global relevance.
Moving then from the what to slightly the who, we've got this vast range of different perspectives and ideas on the material constitution. Who do you see this as being of most interest to and perhaps most relevance to, short of everyone?
I don't know, Marco, do you have any? Yeah, everyone should read this book.
No,
Yeah.
look. I mean, my feeling is that the I would say the obvious audience and the obvious target are constitutional scholars, constitutional theorists, but also, in my view, comparative constitutional scholars. And I would add, on top of this, in my view, other, I would say, recent streams of scholarship, like law and political economy scholars, because I can clearly see how they could use the concept of the material constitution for those who wants to do, constitutionalism within LP type of approaches. And I mean, this might sound a bit too ambitious, but my feeling is that also for those political scientists who are working on basically political systems, I think there is a sense in which the material constitution might be a good heuristic concept to start with, to start thinking about political systems and their formation. I think it's very difficult to disentangle modern political system from the development of the material constitution. This is, in my view, is the core constituency of the handbook. There might be more, but this is, in my view, is the core constituency.
Yeah, and clearly, I think there's this relevance there to what is a really, really wide audience, and I think your suggestion is perhaps that this is going to open up new lines of inquiry in different places in different disciplines further on. We'll touch on that shortly, but you mentioned earlier this is not so much an editor's collection as a handbook. How did this handbook come together, and what were some of the main challenges also that you sort of faced in getting this all in one place?
Yeah, so it was a challenge, for sure. Starting from the very first draft that Marco and I put together, which obviously took some time. When you're working as a co-author, these things are very productive because you're, in a sense, you're building, from each other. But it also takes a while. And we had knockbacks, and I think this is worth also mentioning for younger scholars who no doubt will face knockbacks of their own. It got rejected from journals that will remain nameless. Eventually, we got it, the first article accepted in the MLR, which wasn't an easy process. We had to persuade resistant, skeptical reviewers. And then Marco really organized the conference in Glasgow. And initially, the thought was that we would have a smaller, narrower, focused, edited collection. And in the end, I think we were very happy that Cambridge suggested a handbook instead, which enabled us to do a much wider survey. I don't know if Marco wants to add anything there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a sense in which the article on the MLR was an attempt not to put the final word or to write the final word on the topic, but actually to start the conversation. And that's why we needed something like a broad project. And obviously, I mean, only the two of us would have not been enough, in order to materialize, the project. And that's why I think the format of the handbook, no pun intended, exactly. And that's why the format of the handbook was particularly suitable for us. It allowed us, and that's the key point, although Mike and I have kind of a specific understanding of the material constitution, if you allow me again the insistence and on the same word, a kind of a materialist understanding, we don't want kind of this type of strict ownership on the approach toward the concept. So the idea was to show that, look, there are actually different takes on the concept, and it is in terms of scholar value, it's scholarship value is basically a good thing to show that there's been different traditions, no, that have basically backed and developed, no, the concept of material constitution. So in itself, actually, it is not, for example, inherently a leftist project. No? It doesn't have that connotation. No? You can clearly have a conservative take on the notion, and you can actually learn from that interpretation. No? And as I think some of the chapters, not the chapter on Schmidt, the chapter on Mortati, in the historical part, no, they show to us that actually there is something to be learned from the tradition. That's why I think the handbook served very, fitted very well with our original intentions. No? It allowed us even to include a few chapters that are actually skeptical on the continuous relevance of the concept, or at least on the ways that's been understood before. No? And that's why we have a section actually even on critiques. No? This is a kind of a luxury, no? Could afford only thanks to the handbook format.
And so you mentioned the critique, the skepticism, this wide range of different approaches of thinking about the material constitution. Where do both of you see scholarship on this going from here? Are there, for example, specific lines of inquiry that you think might be pursued, or that might be most promising?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it's worth maybe just rewinding and thinking that we wouldn't want to overdo the skepticism and critique. In a sense, we were surprised by how engaged even those who we had thought would be more skeptical and critical have become to the concept, including those contributors, but also elsewhere. So, in a sense, we're still awaiting a real critique, as it were. I think is a concept that has a lot of attraction. But yes, in terms of where it goes forward, as Marco said, we've never intended to write the last word on it, and so a lot of where it goes from here will depend upon what readers make of it, what the existing contributors, how they develop their arguments. There certainly remains a lot more work to be done in each of those areas, and those three sort of thematic sections. But also because the concept itself is a concept with a history, with a past and a present, and one hopes with a future, it's a continually moving object, and so will necessarily require dynamic analysis of things moving forward. Liberal democracy continues to be under huge threats. Constitutional turbulence continues. And perhaps one thing that I think is perhaps missing from the collection, and that I would like to see develop, whether I'm able to do this myself, I don't know, but is to think about the environment and the relationship between the Constitution and the natural world. What we might call the metabolic relationship between humans and nature that is the current of so much discussion, is also, of course, a constitutional question, and in some ways a material constitutional question of immense significance. And that's something which I would like to see moving forward. But perhaps there's something for some PhD students to jump on. Yeah,
I just want to add that I wouldn't be surprised if certain debates might actually start exploring the heuristic potential of the notion. No? Think, for example, of the debates in the European Union about constitutional identity, no? Which have been run mostly in classic liberal constitutional theory. You could clearly see that it could be bent and actually reshaped by looking at constitutional identity from the perspective of the material constitution, no? Which would allow, I would say, to understand the concept, not just to dismiss it, but to understand the concept with a different language and a different understanding. I also think that, in my view, there will certainly be people who are interested in the political economy that will definitely explore other facets. I mean, a bit what Mike was already saying about the environment and the relationship between human action and nature is probably part and parcel, no, of that constellation. So I wouldn't be surprised if this comes up. I mean, there is a tradition even in liberal constitutional theory. If you think at the section of the Esprit de Loi by Montesquieu on on how climate, I mean, it clearly doesn't thematize climate change. No, that's impossible, but it is thematizing, an impact of climate on the formation of constitutional orders and governments. So there's plenty of work there that could be done and expanded.
From the sounds of it, I think there's clearly relevance here to, I think, both the broad variety of different constitutional issues you were sort of dealing with. You mentioned constitutional identity as an example, and I think also as a result, naturally, things that cut across various jurisdictions as well. Problems of the environment are very much global problems. Constitutional identity, I think we've seen in Ireland recently, there's been some discussion. I'm sure that's been the case in other jurisdictions as well. So from the sound of it, there is a lot to come on the material constitution. Perhaps just to round things off, could I ask, what are both of you working on right now? What's next, whether material constitution or otherwise, in terms of academic projects?
Yeah, sure. So I'm working on a couple of things at the moment. One sort of small projects related to this issue of Eurocentrism, and particularly thinking about the relationship between European integration and imperialism, something which is very much coming to the fore at the moment. It's not something which I'm going to write a book on, but something which I'm preparing a series of interventions into. And the second thing is a book project, which is a prelude to authoritarian liberalism and the transformation of modern Europe, where I want to sketch out the emergence of authoritarian liberalism in the long 19th century, from the French Revolution to the First World War. That's like a five-year at least plus project, so it will keep me going for a good while longer.
Well, I mean, for what concerns the material constitution, actually the plan is that I'll be on research leave from January for a semester, and I want to finish the translation from Italian into English of Mortatis, the material constitution. I have translated half of the book, but I still need to translate the other half of the book, and this is quite time-consuming. But I finally will have a few months to sit down and finalize this. And then I'm also writing and thinking about the role of central banks in contemporary constitutional orders, from the perspective of a conception of money.
Fantastic! I think we have certainly a lot to look forward to, whether in the coming months or coming years. So thank you to both Professor Marco Goldoni and Mike Wilkinson for joining us today. Thank you to our listeners and viewers. If you enjoyed this discussion, if you're interested in getting hold of this handbook, have a look at the new titles and discounts section on the IACL blog website. For more of the same, keep up to date with the blog by following us on Twitter, or X as it now seems to be called, and subscribing to our mailing list. Lastly, if you've recently published a book on constitutional law and would like to be featured in a book interview, do get in touch with us at iacl.blogeditor@gmail.com. Thank you once again, and goodbye.